Unless you've spent the last several weeks living under a rock, you've probably heard all about how this idiot, Greg Locke, claims to have learned from demons that there are several witches in his church. Now, people don't say this kind of thing often in our society, for obvious reasons, so naturally it piqued everybody's interest. How could he claim such an outrageous ability? Is he at all sincere about it? Does he have the names of any specific people in mind, and is he actually going to call them out? Where's he ultimately going with this whole thing? There's a lot to be curious about here, even at first glance, which is why this story has gained so much traction. In fact, you'll probably forgive me for suggesting Greg knows he's getting attention and that, to be perfectly blunt, that's part of the idea. Even if he's not putting on a self-aware carnival act, he has to know that a church witch hunt makes for attention-grabbing headlines, and that his rabid way of carrying on about this nonsense gives gawkers what they came for. Because to whatever extent he is or is not conscious of it, his audience has trained him to expect applause for shouting appalling garbage and dancing around the stage like a performing monkey, while the rest of the world has taught him that the same behavior will get him passed around the internet by the outraged and the curious, as well as made a folk hero to increasingly embolden Christian nationalists, and he benefits greatly from both reactions. Now, I get the irony in talking about giving Greg exposure while, here I am making a video about him, but I'm not entirely critical about everybody who talks about him. Even though he gets some benefit and enjoyment from the exposure, there is legitimate reason to shed light on characters like this, and he's already gotten way more fame than I'm going to give him. Besides, my point isn't really about Greg Locke. It's about a much deeper problem. See, Greg's routine is really not that unique once you look past the initial shock value. As someone who grew up in charismatic Pentecostal churches, I found basically everything he did familiar to the point of being formulaic. There was the way he teased out hints of some sensationalized spiritual battle.
We got first and last names of 6 witches that are in our church. And you know what's strange? 3 of you are in this room right now.
Which is something he kept doing throughout his sermon.
We got your first name, we got your last name, we even got an address for one of you!
Keeping his audience on the edge of their seats with assurances about how much he knows and what he'll do with that knowledge while holding back the big reveal. And not only does he dangle this supposed knowledge in front of his congregation, but he holds it over the heads of his supposed enemies as his way of communicating to the flock that they're out to get you, but we're in complete control.
You so much as cough wrong and I'll expose you in front of everybody in this tent, you stinking witch. You better look in my eyeballs. We ain't afraid of you, you stinking witch. You devil-worshiping Satanist witch. We cast you out in the name of Jesus Christ. We break your spells. We break your curse.
Of course, any former charismatic and or Pentecostal will recognize his theatrical way of raging against the devil, or in this case I guess witch, and hyping how very not afraid he is while proclaiming how and in whose name this malevolent force will be driven out. You'll also notice how Greg does it all with his affected air of personal machismo, which is fairly common among these kinds of pastors. Sure, the premise is that they're victorious through the power of Jesus and all that, but on a much more visceral level, he feels like the strong presence in the room, leading his audience to be instinctively drawn to him and submissive to his leadership. This doesn't happen by accident. Greg and pastors like him cultivate this persona like a professional wrestler hyping his audience before a coming fight. Except in this case it has a more profound and dangerous effect on his audience, because not only is he pretending all this nonsense is real, but he's doing so in a way that shapes their attitude toward the world and prepares them to act a certain way toward it. I could go on and on, but the point is that on a fundamental level, he's less an outlier than an exemplar of what's wrong with Christianity. And what makes him stick out is a matter of degree and boundaries more than substance. Of course, we can see how he pushes the envelope of dangerous and appalling rhetoric a little further than others. That's obvious. But along with that, I see one key difference between him and the many churches I attended that dabbled in prophecy. And that is that most of these churches had an implicit and sometimes directly stated practice of keeping their prophecies positive. Their words from the Lord were usually encouraging, non-threatening platitudes rambled out in stream of consciousness, usually remarkably free of any information the congregation didn't already have. You know, "Thus saith the Lord, you are my children, the sheep of my pasture, and I love you." Know that you are in the palm of my hand, and I have great plans for you, if only you will continue to seek my face, and so on. If there were any negative prophecies, they were about vague targets from outside the church, such as the devil or maybe popular punching bags like abortion doctors or the LGBTQ community or whoever take prayer out of schools. And the overall message was an uplifting one about the church staying faithful and triumphing over these forces. Never once did I hear someone stand up and say, "Thus saith the Lord, Bob Jenkins looks at dirty magazines and you'll find a bunch of them shoved behind the old paint buckets in his garage." There are two reasons for this. One, it's confrontational, and two, it requires the prophecy to produce actual information. So Greg crosses a common line when he claims to divine specific accusations against members of his own church. And because he crosses this line, and because he's so, awful, it might feel like he's doing something that really sets him apart from other Christians. Thus it's worth asking, why was Greg willing to step over this line? And what really changed, or didn't change, when he did? The fact is, Greg had to have some kind of practical motivation for what he did. Now sure, part of it can be chalked up to the fact that he needs to create this kind of sensationalistic stir every so often. I mean, that's what keeps him a major national figure instead of just one more unknown irrelevant moron screaming at a tent full of hillbillies in his little corner of the woods, right? But that doesn't explain how this benefited Greg within his church. There had to be a dynamic that made it worthwhile to navigate the perils of turning prophecy against his own congregation. And when we watch more of these clips, we don't need to read too far between the lines to get a feel for the all-too-natural social dynamics at play and the way he was using supernatural claims to his advantage. From the start, we can see how the whole thing gave him an incredible amount of control over the room. By invoking a spiritual enemy you have unique knowledge about, you can rally a congregation behind you and immediately cast anybody who doesn't fall in line, or even suggest any nuance that tempers your narrative, as being with the enemy. Greg has a forceful personality, and seeing how he foams at the mouth and gets the room worked up over this threat of witches, you can just feel how intensely uncomfortable, even untenable it would be for anybody in that room to do anything other than nod their head and agree. Now sure, an outside target works fine for this purpose, while posing less risk for the speaker, but bringing the accusations in-house has its uses too, as it creates an environment of hysteria and fear that Greg can put to good use. The moment he says there are 6 witches in the church and 3 present in the room, he has his congregants eyeballing each other while hoping nobody's suspicious of them. And anybody who's run into conflict with Greg is going to be acutely aware that the finger might get pointed at them, giving them motivation to start kissing his ass and avoid any fresh disagreements. As he goes on, notice how he continues to tighten the screws, using a methodical, almost artful way of narrowing everybody's suspicions while making suspects feel like the hounds are closing in around them.
Listen, some of you been sick because you befriended that witch. 2 of you in my wife's ladies' Bible study, and you know who you are.
While this...
And we gonna ask you to get out, or I'll expose you in front of everybody.
And this...
You can leave with your spells all by yourself. Or I'll show up next Sunday with a stage full of brooms. And I'll give you one, and I'll fly your tail up out of this place in the name of Jesus.
Turns up the heat on anybody who might have crossed Greg in any way. Regardless of all the spiritual theater, he's aware of the social pressure he's applying, and so do his targets. With these threats of pointing fingers and his vague, bizarre, but intense talk of running people out of the church on brooms, he's leaning on his enemies hoping they'll get uncomfortable enough to leave. In short, this is a church purge at work. It's not too unusual for pastors to use this kind of spiritual language or pressure to get people to leave, but it seems Locke saw benefit in using more intense tactics aimed more directly at people. If we look at another sermon within the same campaign of terror, we'll start to get a better picture of why. First, he uses the narrative to insulate himself against any kind of criticism.
I'm talking about people that are involved in full-blown divination. Full-blown spirit of witchcraft. So it'll only affect a few of you. It'll affect some of you online because they've been reaching out to you talking about how low down, sorry, and good for nothing we are, but we've been nothing but good. So I ain't got nothing to hide, so that's why I drop names sometimes.
So, church, if anybody contacts you saying anything bad about me, it's one of those witches or someone aligned with them. It's pretty brazen when you think about it. And we get more clues what he's up to once he starts to name names.
Listen to me. I love you as your shepherd to tell you something. If you have ever publicly, privately, in their house, in this church, I don't care where, if you have ever been prayed over, had hands laid on you by Brian and Gina Warren, you are under a curse of witchcraft. You hear me? I know that shocks you. She's a witch. She deceived some people. She cursed people in this house right now.
And he quickly puts this accusation to strategic use.
And when we did a final phone call and just said, look, you can't be our security anymore. You ain't rolling with us no more. We see it for what it is. They went nuts. And guess what? All the people that they got us in line with, ministry-wise, she started calling them. Can I have your platform? I'm going to destroy him. Can I have your platform? Hey, you try to destroy me all you want to. Witch, you're done. You are done in the name of Jesus Christ. You're done.
Now, I don't know who these people are, but it's clear they and Greg had a falling out, and Greg doesn't want people hearing their side of the story, so he uses this accusation of witchcraft to make a preemptive strike at their credibility before they have the chance to tell it. This isolates his enemies, deplatforming them and making it clear which side you're taking if you do platform them. He goes on to use this anecdote to show that they have nowhere to go.
Then she called somebody the other day and said, I'm going to go talk to his friend in Chattanooga, Kevin Wallace, who, by the way, we have come to preach here. I called Kevin. He said, thanks for letting me know. We won't let that witch around us.
So all it takes is a call from Greg accusing someone of being a witch, and other preachers will ostracize them. And relaying this story makes it clear to the rest of the congregation that if they take the wrong side or even push back with healthy questions, they might find themselves in the same boat. He even makes them distrust their own sense of discomfort in what is naturally a very uncomfortable situation.
I know some of you getting nervous, scratching your head, folding your arms. You got heartburn, headache. That's just that spirit of divination she called over you that's getting angry inside of you. You can get mad all you want. You can get pissed off all you want. You can get upset all you want. You got the wrong one. I'm telling you right now, in the name of Jesus, we cast out the spirit of divination. We cast out them curses and that witchcraft that's been spoken over this church.
So it's not enough to make people doubt each other. He has to make them doubt themselves. It's natural to have a feeling of discomfort when a character like Greg Locke goes into a rage accusing people of being witches. It might make you nervous, it might make you mad, and it might make you feel a little weird. These emotions are likely to manifest in some bodily symptoms. And while I'm not one to suggest automatically listening to your gut, there's good reason to pause and wonder why a speaker is making you this uncomfortable. Greg knows this, which is why he tells you that all these internal sirens warning you about the crazy-eyed rabbit badger on stage are just the effects of witchcraft. In short, this whole thing smacks of an attempt to shore up control, apparently following some kind of disagreement with other people in the church, by getting everybody to distrust each other and even themselves, to only trust him, or at the very least be afraid to tell anybody else they don't trust him. And his audience's belief in supernatural claims he isn't expected to demonstrate gives him the permission structure to do this. Now, is this different from what other churches do? Sure, depending on the church, but it's worth considering how and to what extent it's actually different. To clarify, let's recall the line I said Greg crosses. Along with his general willingness to be more horrible than usual, he chooses specific targets within the church and makes more tangible accusations against them. But does a church really fix anything just by staying on the right side of this line? I'd say no, because as long as a room full of grown adults will accept undemonstrated claims of God-revealed knowledge, any pastor will be operating within the same permission structure Greg is. Meaning he can still level accusations for the same dangerously unhinged reasons Greg does. He might just be more motivated to keep his factual claims unfalsifiable and his targets vague or outside the church. But while this avoids certain forms of infighting, it still leaves a pastor with the power to put people on guard against boogeymen of his choice, or the world in general, for intense but completely superstitious reasons. To focus their fear, hatred, and sense of purpose in whatever arbitrary directions he wants, as long as he's forceful and charismatic enough, and as long as he knows how far to push things and which targets to pick. This is a dangerous amount of power to wield. It can even leave room to bully his way through church controversies and low-key defame his rivals as long as he stays closer to the level of insinuation. I mean, just look back at all the forms of manipulation Greg was using. All it takes is a little tweaking, and most of these tricks can be, indeed are, available to pastors who are considered acceptable because they've cleared the low bar of not being as overtly offensive as Greg Locke. What's more, once you open the door to this kind of thinking, further abuses are always possible. Because the line Greg crosses isn't a logical line, it's a pragmatic line. There's nothing about the function of spiritual revelation that prohibits these kinds of accusations, so the only thing that holds pastors back from them, aside from personal scruple, is that they're risky and not worth it. So if a pastor who's unscrupulous to any degree does consider it worth it, why would he not flirt with or even cross this line? These general corrupting influences are an inherent danger of religion, including Christianity. Sure, it's tempting to view the problem with Greg Locke on a visceral level, to feel how bad he is when he's at his worst and take these obvious symptoms as the problem. Book burnings and witch hunts make easy targets because they grab us by the collar and scream in our face that something's gone wrong. That's why they get our attention, and that's why they're part of Greg's brand. It's also why Christianity can get away with offering him up as a scapegoat while ignoring conversations that get to the root of the problem. This gives them an easy reaction, which is to say they're appalled that he misrepresents Christianity. And I think this reaction is usually sincere. But the fact is, Locke doesn't misrepresent it because there is no one Christianity to misrepresent. He just represents it in one of many countless ways. And since Christians have no verifiable way to demonstrate which of those ways is right, Christianity simply can't fix Greg Locke. In fact, it can avoid being Greg Locke to some extent. As I'll explain next time, the simple fact is that at its core, his problem is Christianity's problem, and the only solutions are secular solutions. This program was made possible by a grant from John Adams, Bob Generic, Maggie Danger, S.R. Foxley, Daniel Bostet, Magnus Holmgren, and Q, and by the generous support of viewers like you. If you'd like to join them in pledging to this channel, please find a link to the Prophet of Zod Patreon below.